Welcome to the third lecture in Module 1, Technologies to Promote Collaboration and Communication in Virtual K-12 Education. In this lesson, we're going to be focused on two outcomes. First, we're going to discuss where and how to utilize emerging technologies for collaborative activities in your classes and to foster communication among your students and between you and your students. Second, we're going to talk about the various types of collaborative and communication technologies available for your use in your courses. So let's continue on with our assumption. We now know that we are committed to virtual education 100% at a distance, and that we're trying to foster the most engaging and effective means for delivering that virtual education, and in this case, specifically around student collaboration and effective course communication. We're going to add to our assumption that your students have access to some sort of mobile or tablet device, either their own mobile or tablet device or one that's issued by your institution. So let's talk a little bit about why we want those devices and what collaborating at a distance looks like. Now, we want to encourage collaboration. We already do this in many of our traditional classes. But just as a reminder, the research tells us that collaboration, and particularly collaboration at a distance, does quite a few good things for our courses. First, it promotes active learning. Particularly at a distance, where learning can be very passive, very individualistic for students, where they're just engaging with content and not necessarily with one another, collaboration promotes a very active learning environment. It also helps you deepen project-based activities. If you're assigning tasks or projects or problems for students to solve, by putting them in a team and having them collaborate around the solution, you're able to have them go more in depth into that problem or that task, and you can have more breadth in the topics or approaches that you encourage that group to take. It also allows you to find opportunities for your students to develop teamwork and leadership skills. By encouraging them to collaborate or creating very deliberate collaborative activities, students have to learn how to work with one another, how to take on various roles within their teams, and how to both lead and act as a team member in solving any of the problems that you set forth. It also emphasizes the value of social skills. Often we hear one of the critiques of virtual education is that students don't learn how to interact with one another. But by encouraging collaborative activities, especially those that use some of the more emerging and innovative technologies available today, you can help students build those critical social skills that often people criticize virtual education for lacking. And finally, one of the best things about collaborating at a distance is that it feeds our millennial generation's needs for socialization, social interaction, and sort of a way to be personal about their learning. Not only do they want to personalize it for their own context, but they also want to be able to be personal or share whom they are with the rest of their classmates. And social collaborative learning gives you an opportunity to do that. So what does social technology look like? Most of them require mobile devices. Much of the kind of social activity or collaborative activity that students are doing are through apps or through social sites. Now, there are some technologies that also have their equivalent just through the internet so that students can use their computer and not need a mobile device. But many of the more emerging technologies do require some sort of mobile device or tablet. And a lot of institutions, at least in the US, are issuing mobile devices for students to have access to these kinds of technologies. The good news is students are already using particularly social media on these devices. As you can see here, this was a study done by a large media organization within the US. As you can see here, in their study group, many students, the majority of students in high school, so ages 13 to 18, are already using the social technologies that I'm going to encourage you to explore for use in your virtual classes. And you'll see here, they're accessing those technologies on mobile devices. Now, what are those mobile technologies or those social technologies, those collaborative technologies? I like to bucket them into three groups. The first set of technologies are collaborative content building technologies. This is where you send your students out to build something together, whether it be a piece of content, a video, it could be a solution to a problem, it could be a game, it could be anything that you think is appropriate to your discipline and the content that you're delivering. Now they can build collaborative content in wikis. An example of that is Wikispaces, as I've mentioned in the last lecture. They can build that content in Etherpad, where they're developing notes and materials and discussing alongside the development of those notes and materials key concepts or key ideas. It could be in Google Docs or any other tool that facilitates the collaborative creation of something related to your course. Now, similarly to collaborative content building, there's collaborative content sharing. In this case, and you can certainly share content through those collaborative content tools, Google Plus is an example of how you could share content that you're creating from Google Docs. But there's a lot of other tools out there where your students can just share their content, both with your classmates, as well as with the world, depending on what you prefer. So these tools include YouTube. YouTube, you can share videos and you can comment on one another's videos. Facebook, we all use Facebook, or many of us use Facebook, or at least know of how to use Facebook. And that's where you can share your ideas, thoughts, links, video, pictures, or anything else that you feel relevant to what you're learning in the moment. You've got things like Tumblr that's similar to Facebook, where you can post your updates or your feelings or things that are happening in that moment. And then you've got Twitter, where you're limited to a very short character space. However, you can reflect very in the moment or in a very just-in-time fashion on things happening around you. You also have sites where you can share content or media like Flickr and Vimeo and Instagram and even Pinterest. All of those allow you to share pictures or videos or slideshows, depending on what you're creating. And then there's even Snapchat. Snapchat is a newer technology that's similar to Facebook that younger students in the US are using to share their emotions or their thoughts in the moment. All of these sites allow for commenting, allow for even voting if you want to encourage that, but certainly allow for not only the exchange of ideas to be one directional, but truly bi-directional, where students can share their ideas and others can respond back to those ideas. Now, the last group of collaborative tools are those that sort of open up more towards discussion and reflection. These are tools that allow for a little more lengthy commentary and are often the kinds of environments where you're engaging in an ongoing conversation about something. These include Facebook. Facebook is now expanding to include longer dialogues and messages and other tools like pages within Facebook. You can even do this in Twitter, because in Twitter, although you have a short capacity in what you're saying, you can reply to people and build quick, short discussion conversations within Twitter that can last 10 seconds or multiple years. Then you've got some of the more traditional writing tools for discussion and reflection, like blogging tools. This can happen in WordPress, Blogger, Gaggle, Class Blogmeister, and even EduBlogs. These are all examples of blogging tools. I'm sure there are many similar blogging tools in the various countries around the world that students can contribute blogs to as well. The nice thing about blogs, once again, is it not only promotes the idea of presenting your ideas out to an audience, but allowing that audience to engage with those ideas and respond and reflect on what you're saying. So I have a couple of quick tips for collaborating with technology, because there's a lot of different technologies. That last slide just represented a short list of some of the most popular technologies that are being used in the United States today in K-12 virtual education. But there's a whole host of them. And so how do you know how best to collaborate with those tools? Now, in our next module, we will be talking more specifically about how to develop lesson plans using many of the social tools listed there. But I wanted to give you a couple of sort of overarching high-level ideas or tips for how to collaborate using these kinds of technologies. First and foremost, and I would say this for any use of a technology, you need to be very clear in your expectations with your students, and you need to keep those expectations focused on the task at hand. Students don't want to use a technology just for the sake of using a technology, and they certainly don't want the technology to become busy work. So you want to be very clear about why you're having the students use that particular technology, and you actually want to model what good collaboration looks like through that technology. They need examples. They're using these tools in a personal setting, not necessarily a learning setting, and they need to understand how to translate them into your learning setting for your disciplines. You also want to emphasize quality over quantity. Now, I know a lot of folks want to count up the number of posts, or they want to have students post one thing and then respond to two other students' ideas or concepts. And while that can be helpful to encourage the initial level of collaboration, that's often artificial or forced. And once again, as I mentioned before, it can become a busy work type of activity. So I encourage you to encourage your students or promote or emphasize quality. It's about what you say and how you reflect and how you respond to others, not how much you do. I also encourage you to allow students to get a little personal. I know there's a fine line between personal for a learning setting and personal that's just not appropriate, and you want to teach that student what that line is. Because students are craving the opportunity to have individual identities and share with one another what those identities are. So let them do that, but give them good understanding of how to do that specifically in your learning context. Also, you should think about using your technologies in a very controlled manner. So when we get into the last lecture in this module, we'll talk about making decisions about what technologies to use and not use. One important thing to think about is your student's safety and your student's privacy. So depending on the age of your student and depending on how open you're making their collaboration to the world, you might need to be careful about how controlled you create that setting. You might need to be very specific, create groups that only your students can have access to. You might need to protect their data, teach them how to create the right types of identities. Perhaps you have them create a separate identity than their personal identities in some of these platforms that's academic only. So thinking about how to coach them so that they're in a controlled and protected environment, yet they still have the opportunity to collaborate and share as you see fit for your particular activity. And finally, I think it's very important to always make parents aware, or guardians, or those folks that are monitoring student work outside the traditional virtual classroom, aware that you're using these technologies. Because different parents, different guardians, they have different rules about how you use your devices and how you interact with others. And if they're very clear about how you're using it in your learning activities, they can then promote that when the student is outside of your reach. Now I have a question for you. I'm now teaching an English class, and I'm encouraging students to write every day. I want them writing every day about things that they're passionate about in their world. So I want to excite them and get them interested in the world around them, and I want them writing. So rather than using a traditional discussion forum in my course learning platform, which is fine, but I want to get them outside of that space. I want them to start sharing with people even outside of their classroom. So I've asked them to post their writing through a social technology. What advantages do you think to student learning having them use a social technology might bring? Okay, now that we've thought about collaboration, let's talk a little bit about communication. We need to think beyond email. In fact, lots of research is showing that students hardly use email anymore. They want to text. They want to collaborate and message through social technologies. So how do you utilize those technologies in your virtual teaching to an advantage? Well, thinking about providing students perhaps with just-in-time course updates. Perhaps you are out on a trip to a museum and you see a piece of art that you think is really important for a particular lesson that you're either doing that week or you're about to introduce. By taking a picture of that piece of art and quickly messaging your students this reflection and this piece of art and getting them excited about what's to come or how this might relate to what they're learning now is a great way to use social technologies and something that wouldn't have been as effective through email. because now students can get that just in time, in real time, in the place that they're already spending a lot of their day interacting with others in. You could also use this as a way to make sure you're reaching out to students in a place that they're regularly checking. You want to get them to be thinking every day about their learning experience, not in isolated periods. You want to try to contextualize learning or broaden their learning to their experiences within your activities and then outside of your activities. And in order to do that, it can be really helpful if you communicate with your students in those same spaces that they're spending time in. It's also a great way to create this living learning community. We all know that this is becoming a force in our daily lives, in our professional lives. We learn from each other so much more than we ever did in the past. And it's so very evident or so very explicit that because of that, it's really important to encourage students to understand how to foster living learning communities. And by doing this and by communicating with your students in these social technologies or collaborative technologies beyond email, you're fostering that idea. And then finally, you can open up your world or your class's world to beyond the confines of the students and the teachers within your institution. There are experts out there that would love to interact with you in a very controlled fashion, of course, and this is a great way to do it. Bring a guest speaker into Facebook or into Twitter. Do a Twitter chat for 2 hours with your students or an hour with your students with experts that you would never be able to bring to them if you didn't have that kind of technology. Now, along similar lines as we talked about with collaborative technology, we do have a couple of good tips for communicating with technology. Very similarly to the collaborative tools, you want to set very clear expectations, particularly around your availability with students when you're using tools to communicate with them beyond email. Be very specific about when and how you will interact with students. For example, perhaps you will be available on Twitter 3 days a week for an hour for students to ask short questions. We'll tell them what days a week you'll be available, what hours you'll be available, and stick to those. Don't then make yourself available at other times and answer questions for students, or else they'll think they can reach you 24/7. And that's one of the biggest challenges I hear from virtual educators is that students expect them to be available all the time because they're using all of these great collaborative and communicative technologies. Well, if you just set expectations right up front with your students, they'll be satisfied with that. They'll know how to interact with you, and you'll protect that work-life balance that probably you're striving for, even though you're teaching in a virtual space. You also want to minimize the number of access points. Be careful not to confuse students and say you're available in 5 different technologies. Not only now are you managing all those technologies, and none of us wants to do that, but you also are confusing students. They don't know what kinds of questions to ask where. And quite often they'll ask everywhere, or worst case, they won't ask anywhere because they don't know where to ask for help. So minimize the number of access points and be very clear of how they should use those access points. And in fact, model good behavior as we mentioned before. Also be consistent throughout your course. Don't change up the technologies. If a student's to ask you questions in Twitter or in Facebook, or are they supposed to post pictures in Instagram, keep it that way throughout the duration of the course. It's confusing to students if you change it up, and it can deflect from the learning activity and put more emphasis on the technology, which is what you're not trying to do. Finally, communicate in the style of the medium. It's really important to use the style of the medium as the way that you're going to communicate with students so that they understand how they can continue to use that medium, and so that it's applicable to the type of mind frame that they'll be in when they're participating in that space. You also want to make sure, as I mentioned before, that parents are always aware of how you're using this to communicate with your students. And in fact, you can use this as a great way to communicate with parents as well, or even to have a communication happen among your students, your parents, and yourself all at the same time. So with that, I encourage you to jump into the next lecture where we'll be focusing on how to use technology to assess both your students and the institutional environment around the learning activities that you're providing.